Good afternoon. There you go. Thanks. Good afternoon. Well, welcome. I'm Roger Ream, president of the Fund for American Studies. We are pleased to be sponsoring this program along with the Office of Senator Rand Paul of Kentucky. It is funded through some generous donors of ours, the Einhorn Family Foundation in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. In a few weeks, the Einhorns will be here for one of our lectures. But we do this each week during the summer for interns from around Washington, D.C., particularly on Capitol Hill, to help give you a program that provides an interesting perspective on the role of government in our society. The important things I want to mention is following the lecture and the Q&A, we will have lunch vouchers for everyone to go downstairs and get a free lunch. It's the one chance to get a free lunch. And our staff will pass those out. The Fund for American Studies sponsors programs around the world for high school and college students and young professionals to learn about limited government and economic freedom. We have about 285 college students in Washington, D.C. this summer, staying at George Washington University, interning in the nation's capital, and taking courses for academic credit through George Mason University. So if you're interested in our programs, just go to dcinternships.org and you can read more about it in case you're looking to come back to Washington for a semester or another summer. I'm going to turn things over to Senator Rand Paul. Senator Paul doesn't need much of an introduction, but he's elected to the Senate in 2010 following a successful career as an ophthalmologist. He was a graduate of Duke Medical School, and before that attended Baylor University in Texas. He's been an active senator and leader in promoting the ideas of economic freedom and liberty and reasonable small size of government that follows our constitutional limitations. He serves on the Foreign Relations Committee, the Homeland Security Committee, the Health, Education, and Labor Committee, and the Small Business and Entrepreneurship Committees. He's a great friend of TFAS, Fund for American Studies, as we call it, TFAS, and of the ideas of liberty. So, Senator Paul, thank you.
Welcome, everybody. Glad you came. It's my pleasure today to introduce a friend of mine, an economist, an author, and a libertarian activist, Matt Kibbe. He's the president of Free the People, an educational foundation that uses video storytelling to inspire the next generation to carry the torch of advocating for personal liberty, peaceful cooperation, and critical thinking. Additionally, he's the host of BlazeTV's Kibbe on Liberty, a popular podcast that insists that you think for yourselves. He's the author of bestsellers Don't Hurt People and Don't Take Their Stuff, a libertarian manifesto, which I've always thought sort of sums up the golden rule of libertarianism in one title. He's also the author of Hostile Takeover, Resisting Centralized Government Stranglehold on America. Matt's appeared frequently on national television, including Fox, HBO's Real Time with Bill Maher, CNN, MSNBC, and PBS. Matt did graduate work in economics at George Mason University and received his BA in economics from Grove City College. He lives in Washington, D.C. with his wife, Terry, who is with us. Please join me in welcoming Matt Kibbe.
So it's an honor to be back. Thank you, Rogers. Thank you, Senator Paul. I always have a lot of fun doing this, and I had to ask Grok this morning when the last time I did this was, and I said, I think it was 3 or 4 years ago, and it was 2019, which when you become of a certain age, you realize that that's not that long ago. But for me, it seems like a lifetime ago. Things have changed so fundamentally since 2019, and the subject of that talk was about socialism, why it doesn't work, and particularly what was at that time a new brand. We rebranded it democratic socialism. So it was a critique basically of central planning, but also looking, could we find common ground with young people flirting with this idea? Going to try to be more positive today, even though there's a lot of reasons not to be positive today. But I'm excited because I just came off of perhaps one of the most important events of my lifetime. I got to see my favorite band, Rush, who just did their 50th anniversary tours, launched in LA 3 nights ago. Now, I realize that's a boomer reference. Does anyone here actually know the band Rush? See, it's the life cycle is beautiful, because if you get old enough, at some point you become cool again. And I know at least Senator Paul. Yeah. Too far? Too far. And by the way, they did a tremendous job, and I wish I could do anything that well in my 70s. We'll see how it goes today, even in my 60s. But it is a boomer reference. But I want to start this by telling a story. When I was 13 years old, I bought a Rush album called 2112. And back then, you actually bought vinyl. It wasn't the cool retro vinyl. It was actually the only way you could listen to music, was to buy an album. And the only reason it mattered was because you could read the liner notes and you could read the lyrics to the songs. 2112 was dedicated to this guy, Ayn Rand. I had no idea who this guy was. I was 13 years old. But this album is dedicated to the genius of Ayn Rand. I found out that she was not a guy, she was a girl, and she was a novelist, and she had written a bunch of books, one of which I stumbled across, called Anthem. And I went down the rabbit hole. Back in the old day, you went down the rabbit hole the analog way. You had to go to a library, and you had to find books. And as you started reading her novels, she would write nonfiction, and in her nonfiction, she recommended this economist, Ludwig von Mises, sort of the godfather of the Austrian School of Economics, eventually made quite famous, I think, by Ron Paul, Senator Paul's dad. And being an awkward teenager who couldn't get girls to say yes to a date, I went and read Austrian economics, which actually made it harder to get a date. And eventually, once you finished with the Austrians, you'd read Hayek, and then you'd read Adam Smith, and of course you'd read The Wealth of Nations. And if you were really, really dorky, you would then go read what's the other one called?
Das Kapital.
Das Kapital. No, that's a different guy. His densest book, Adam Smith's densest book, is called The Theory of Moral Sentiments. And fast forward to when I'm writing my book, Don't Hurt People and Don't Take Their Stuff, the joke, which was not a joke, was how could I translate all 750 pages of The Theory of Moral Sentiments, written in Old English? How could I translate all those books on Austrian economics? You know, could I borrow liberally from the Ten Commandments and the New Testament, and maybe even channel some of those Rush lyrics that turned me on to these ideas? And I came up with this phrase that was appropriate for Twitter at the time. We were only allowed 40 characters way back then. Don't hurt people and don't take their stuff. And it sounds sort of obvious, and yes, I got it through all those books, and if you go through all 750 pages of the Theory of Moral Sentiments, that's what he wrote. Of course, he didn't have Twitter, so give him a chance to sort of work out his ideas. But as it turns out, I suspect Adam Smith and every one of us who nod their heads when I say don't hurt people and don't take their stuff, you're thinking to yourself, you stole that from my mom. Because that's what she told you, right? And her mom taught her that. She stole that from her mom. And moms and dads and parents and neighbors, everybody knows that you shouldn't hurt people or take their stuffs. So that should have been the end of the conversation, but of course I was writing a book, so I had to come up with something more than just the tweet. So I came up with this idea that I was going to write the rules for liberty. And this was, at the time, a riff on Saul Alinsky's Rules for Radicals, which was kind of a leftist community organizer manifesto that in a lot of ways is quite cynical, because it's about grassroots organizing, it's about driving public opinion, but it's kind of manipulative. But the thing I like about the Rules for Liberty, conversely, is that it's just common sense. If you leave politics out of it, and if you leave partisanship and Republican versus Democrat and who you're supporting for president, I've yet to meet a person that is offended when I wear my T-shirt that says, don't hurt people and don't take their stuff. So let me run through these rules quite quickly and see if I say anything that is controversial. Start with don't hurt people. And, you know, I got this from Ayn Rand, who is all about self-ownership. You own yourself. Your body is yours. It's your property. And that is both your right and your responsibility to do something useful with your life. But no decent person thinks that you should hurt people. There's a reason why murder is the first of the 10 commandments, thou shalt not kill. Everybody agrees on this. It's the only way that we can cooperate as human beings. But this, of course, is not new information. This is, as Senator Paul said, this is the golden rule. And you can find iterations of this in every civil society. Any society that has succeeded at anything has always agreed on that. You know, libertarians make it more complicated because we call it the non-aggression principle. Because, you know, God forbid that someone actually understand what you're saying when you use the words that you should use. So the non-aggression principle basically says you shouldn't hurt people unless they hurt you first. You have a right to self-defense. You have a right to defend your family. You have a right to defend your country if you're attacked. That is the non-aggression principle in practice, but we don't need to make it that complicated. The second half of that sentence, don't take people's stuff, apparently that's a little more controversial. Now, none of us here would steal from our neighbors. We wouldn't steal from, well, maybe you'd steal from your siblings, but they probably had it coming, right? But you just wouldn't do that to someone in your community, in your neighborhood, and your mom certainly taught you that stealing is wrong. But here in Washington, D.C., we've come up with this idea that it's sometimes okay to outsource stealing to a third party. No offense to the sitting senator in the room, but sometimes members of Congress steal other people's stuff. And sometimes when we go to the voting booth, we're very comfortable voting for someone that promises something to us that is paid for with somebody else's money, that is taken through taxes. Yes, I'm a libertarian, and yes, taxation is theft. The question that we face here in Washington, D.C. is not whether or not taxation is theft, but do you believe in a system that limits government thievery? And that's why we have a Constitution. That's why we have separation of powers. That's why, you know, back in the salad days of the Tea Party, we actually had this idea that government shouldn't spend money it doesn't have. And I know that sounds radical and crazy, that we probably can't run deficits forever. We probably shouldn't have $40 trillion in debt. And yet here we are today, in large part driven by the fact that once you separate the victim and the robber from that crime of taking someone else's stuff, it becomes an abstraction as opposed to a reality. And now we do it. We fund all sorts of things, and there's all sorts of special interests that walk the halls of Congress asking members and their staffers to support things that is a wealth transfer, sometimes to the fat-cattest corporations in the world, from people that are just barely making ends meet. But the most insidious version of that, and something that we're dealing with right now, my friend Jeffrey Tucker just ran the numbers, and those of you who have been here for a couple of years, we've had these endless omnibus bills, and I could go back further, but certainly the CARES Act during the first year of lockdowns, and most recently the big beautiful bill, spending trillions and trillions of dollars that we didn't have. And we couldn't possibly raise the taxes to pay for all that stuff, and there's actually a limit on how much money you can borrow. So what we've been doing is we've been printing money. And we've been monetizing all of that debt. And my friend Jeffrey Tucker just ran the numbers. This is shocking even for me, who I think I understood what was happening at the time. Since 2019, if your income is $100,000 a year, which is a good income, you've lost half of your purchasing power just since 2019. Now trend that out for just a couple more years and a couple more decades, and you will discover that the most insidious tax, the most insidious form of stealing today is it's not taxation, it's not borrowing, it's not the kind of theft that happens when someone sticks you up in an alley and steals your wallet. It's stealing the money out of your bank account and your paycheck. And people know this. It's not just gas prices, and gas prices are driven by other things as well right now because of the war in Iran. But when you go to buy groceries, you realize you can't buy nearly what you could before. It turns out you can buy about half. That's unsustainable, and we have to do something about that. Rule number 3, take responsibility. As a libertarian, I just talked about self-ownership. And libertarians are very good about talking about this. We love to yell on the internet whether or not we're being detained, and we really believe in individual autonomy. And sometimes it comes off as if we're just those rugged individualists that don't give a damn about anything or anybody. It's a stereotype. It's wrong, because to me, liberty is a responsibility. It's when you look in the mirror every morning and say to yourself, particularly if you care about, like, you guys are all here because you care about something. You're here to make a difference. And if you do that, you know that the most important burden that you have as an individual is answering that question when you look in the mirror in the morning. What did I do? What did I do differently? What could I do to help a friend or a family member or a neighbor or a community or my country? And to me, that's the flip side of the libertarian coin, that the sense of robust community that can only happen when people are free. You can't mandate compassion. Think about how absurd that sounds. I'm going to force you to care about your neighbors. Doesn't happen. Like, sure, you can demand that we pay more taxes, or you can steal our money through inflation, but real compassion for other people is something that is voluntarily taken on. It's a responsibility that you have for yourself. And I think about this, this is something that, if we're critiquing socialism, and if we're critiquing all of these good-sounding programs that are intended to help people, homelessness. We just finished a documentary about homelessness that I'll talk about in a minute. But the philosophy of liberty that I grew up on, all those books that I was talking about I read, it's really about the power of free people, all of whom have a special ability, they have special knowledge, they have special dreams about what they want to accomplish for themselves and their families. And when they come together and start cooperating, and they start doing things together, either on a volunteer basis or a business basis, you get something that my old graduate professor called a greater social intelligence. Now that sounds kind of socialist, but it's not, because it all comes from the bottom up. It's all decentralized, and together people are doing things, and they're building things, and they're solving problems in a way that no single person could have ever done. And this was Frederick Hayek's critique of central planning in the first place. You can't possibly know enough. Forget if you're good enough. Forget if power doesn't corrupt you. You can't possibly know enough to reimagine this discovery process, this creative process that is the market process. Now we talk about markets, and we talk about how markets solve problems and put food on your table and all that stuff. But I don't think it has to be a transaction. It could just be people in a neighborhood worried about crime, realizing that just hiring more cops is not going to solve that problem. Maybe we need to take that responsibility on ourselves. And back to the homelessness documentary that we're about to release, it's not about spending more money. We talked to a recovering addict and former homeless guy, Jared, who's the hero in our hero's journey in this document, and he comes from California. And if anybody's looked at the numbers in California, you know that the more they spend, the worse the problem gets. And you see this dynamic in other things that, well, all the things that we think are really important. How do we solve homelessness? How do we make sure that people aren't in poverty? How do we make sure that people get good education? There's this dilemma that we have where the more we spend, the less we get. And in some ways, you actually, you create more problems the more you spend. And as it turns out in our documentary, our friend Jared that we're following through this really, really tragic story of his life. His parents died of overdoses. He becomes an addict in the streets of San Francisco. He nearly kills himself so many times and has so many near-death experiences. And the system wanted to keep him in the system. The housing industrial complex, the solution in California right now is to build more houses, homes for homeless people. And it doesn't work. It sounds like it would work, but it doesn't work. And he explains that it wasn't until an individual working for a nonprofit that didn't accept all of the government money, that forced you to build houses, an individual took the time to pull him out and to teach him about that responsibility of freedom. This is a story that we should tell more and more, because ultimately we're not going to solve our problems with borrowed money, inflated dollars. We're going to have to figure out how to turn people on to this idea that they can solve their own problems. And not only can they solve those problems, but if they're willing to take that responsibility, some really beautiful things could happen. And I don't think that's conservative. I don't think that's liberal. I don't think it's right. I don't think it's left. I think it's the very nature of people when they're free to take responsibility. Number 4, not unrelated, work for it. I watched this debate over artificial intelligence right now, and a lot of people are saying, you know, technology is going to put everybody out of work, particularly people your age. You need to be anxious about this because you're going to be replaced by robots, and you're not going to have anything to do, and we're going to have to pass universal basic income to keep you fat and happy. I think I can't imagine a more dystopian future, and I'm not worried that technology is going to take our jobs, but I do think that we need to turn people on to this idea that work is one of the beautiful things in life. It has become a pejorative, right? It seems like work is a grind, and I got to get up in the morning, and my boss is a butthole, and my guys say this every morning when they get up. And it's not that at all. And again, going back to Rush the Band, they turned me on to a book by Ayn Rand called The Fountainhead. And The Fountainhead is about an architect named Howard Rourke who quits college because he doesn't think that he's going to get anything he needs from college. He wants to start doing his work. And he tells the guy, and I actually put this up on my wall when I was in college, he tells the guy, I have about 60 years of productive activity, and if I don't pursue the kind of work that I want to do, I'm assigning myself 60 years of misery, the grind, the struggle, without the upside of actually achieving something that makes me feel good about my life. And he goes on to talk to one of his college roommates who's kind of a go-along and get-along guy. He's doing everything that his teachers and society is telling him to do. And Howard asks him, well, what do you want? What do you want to do? And Peter says, I don't know. And Howard says, you have to know. And I put this on my wall because I had no idea what I wanted to do. But the pressure of trying to figure out something that is fulfilling in life, it's kind of a more uplifting version of what Jordan Peterson talks about when he tells young people to make their beds. And he tells you to do that because if you don't do that, you're going to fall into the abyss and life is going to be hell. I don't think that's true. But I do think that if you don't have a purpose in life, and if you don't take the responsibility to find that purpose, life is not going to be fulfilling. It's going to be boring. It's going to be a grind, and work is going to become a pejorative. I think we need to rescue that idea that it's pretty cool to work because it's pretty cool to control your own life. And there's a satisfaction. It doesn't mean it's easy. I mentioned Jared's hero's journey. Like, he had to go to the bottom before he came back out on the top. And you're going to have jobs that suck. You're going to have bosses that suck. But you should be restless enough to find something better. Because other than family, that's one of the coolest things you're going to do in your life. You're going to spend a lot of time working. And I do think we need to turn on people that somehow think that the free market system, the capitalist system, I don't like the C word, but we'll use it here, that somehow it's a system of exploitation. I don't think we should view it that way. I think we should view work as the most liberating thing we could do as individuals. Number 5, and this gets controversial, mind your own business. And here in Washington, D.C., we're pretty bad at that. We love to pass legislation because we want to make sure that everybody is living their lives the way that we envision we should live our lives. And I wish that wasn't true in Washington, D.C. I'll just pick on one group right now, the so-called national conservatives. And the national conservatives generally argue that all of this laissez-faire, limited government, balance the budget, keep people out of other people's lives, it's wrong-headed. We should use the government. We should grab the reins of power and force people to live a good life. And we're going to define what a good life is because we know better than the people who aren't living a good life. And it gets into all these practical problems that I was just describing, like the same way that, this is a caricature, but I'll say it for this, the same way that the left has really wanted us to invest in homelessness and anti-poverty programs, the right, the national right wants us to live a virtuous life, however they might define that. Well, I got news for you. Power corrupts. And absolute power corrupts absolutely. But more importantly, central planning doesn't work. And if you have this idea of passing a law that's going to somehow strengthen the family, it will have unintended consequences that might, in fact, damage the family. It might undermine the very values that you hold dear. There's no good power or bad power. There's only limited power or unlimited power. And I happen to be in the camp that wants to limit power as much as possible. I don't want you guys to have power here in Washington, D.C. I want you to have power back in your communities, back in your homes. That was the genius of the American model. And finally, to that point, the sixth and final rule of liberty is fight the power. And this was originally intended to be a call to action where I'm telling people that if you want control of your own government, if you want to see better outcomes of Washington, D.C., maybe you'd like to see them stop inflating by spending so much money they don't have. Maybe you'd like to see them get out of all these unnecessary wars. Maybe you'd like to see them stop surveilling you, even though you've done nothing wrong and there's no reason for the government to be reading your emails or following your TikTok traffic. You got to show up. And you got to show up in a way that doesn't drive political outcomes. I'm talking about cultural outcomes. I'm talking about the way that people think about the world around them, the way that we interpret the news, the opinions that all of us have when we go back to Thanksgiving for dinner. And, you know, crazy Uncle Bob is over here, and he's got his MAGA hat on. And then Aunt Jane is over here, and she's got her AOC T-shirt on. It's going to be defined at that very bottom-up level. And that point, to me, is fundamentally the point of this talk. This is not about politics. It's not about choosing the right next president. It's not about Team Red versus Team Blue. Because when I wear my Don't Hurt People and Don't Take Their Stuff T-shirt, I wore one to the Rush show, and granted it might have been a friendlier audience. I've never once had a person say, that T-shirt pisses me off. Everybody, no matter where I go, say, I love that shirt, man, that's cool. And when I wrote this book, I think I was writing in the idea that I would turn on conservatives to a more libertarian approach to public policy and just these basic values. The irony being is that some of my favorite stories, conversion stories, if you will, came from the left, and I'll just tell two before I wrap up. I was scheduled to debate someone from the ACLU, who is now a good friend of ours, and she was trying to figure out, and at the time I was notorious. I was one of those Tea Party guys, and long before woke culture, we were also labeled as Nazis and racists and God knows what else. So I was that guy. I was a bad person, totally a bad person in the minds of my ACLU debate partner. And so she went and got a copy of the book. And we were sitting with her at dinner the night before, and she's talking to Terry because she's still not sure if I'm a monster or not. And Terry's not sure either, but and we're in a group of very progressive people. And she keeps talking to Terry and said, I read the book, and the end of the story ends with, she whispers to Terry so that none of her colleagues hear her, I think I might be a libertarian. And it's not a dirty word. It's okay. I don't like any of the isms all that great, but I can't think of a better word to use to say that. A better story, one of our best friends from Grove City College, a guy named Ed, I won't out his last name, perhaps the only hardcore lefty to come out of Grove City, one of our dearest friends. He loves this shirt. Don't hurt people and don't take their stuff. And he said, I'm going to this big Black Lives Matter rally organized by Al Sharpton, and I want to wear your shirt. And I'm like, okay. And he said that he has never, everybody stopped him and said, I love that shirt. I love that message. That's beautiful. The point of that story is that everything I just said, hopefully, is not that controversial. And yes, if you're fighting over legislation, or you're fighting over your party's nominee, or you're fighting over voter registration, and you're on this team and they're on that team, people stop listening to each other. But if you can translate the things that you're passionate about into a set of values, common sense stories, that's what we try to do at Free the People, and the reason we make films and documentaries and comedy and all that stuff. And I don't quote from Ludwig von Mises and Adam Smith is because people will process the world through common sense and emotions. And if we want to win the battle for the future, that's precisely what we need to do. Thank you guys so much. And we do have time for questions?
Yeah, we have microphones. So raise your hand and you'll get a mic. And please just say where you go to college. Over here.
Hostile questions are awesome, by the way. Just take the bark off me.
Hi, my name is Eden. I go to American University. I'm interning here in for the Senate. First of all, just thank you so much. What you said was all really fascinating and super interesting. I just had a question. So one of the quotes that I wrote down from you was "mind your own business," which I think is, a very great point. But I was just wondering if I get your opinion on something. So mainly about the government kind of staying out of personal decisions. As we can see in the recent years, there's a lot of trying to be government influence on things like abortion, LGBTQ, vaccines. How do you feel like the government can best make sure that they mind their own business? Is having a government protections to make sure that people can make those own decisions for themselves the best way? Or should the government stay out of it completely, but then it kind of gets into the state's hands? If that makes sense, what I'm saying?
Yeah. I mean, I do think that the more local those sorts of decisions are made, the better, even when it comes to questions like abortion. And I would call myself pro-life, but I'm not really excited about federal prohibitions because I think, again, you might get counterproductive outcomes with that. I thought you were going to ask the most difficult question, which is transitioning kids. And I'll bring it up.
I was hesitant to bring that one up.
It's easily as complex as it gets. And certainly I'm 100% against it. I think it's awful, and I'm speaking as someone that has very close trans friends, trans adults friends. But one of the dilemmas for conservatives and libertarians is whether or not we think, particularly at the federal level, we should get involved in mandating what being a good parent is, because that's a Pandora's box. And if you fully believe, and I believe, that transitioning kids is a form of child abuse, I'd love for it to stop. But I think it's an education thing. I think it's a cultural thing. I think it's something that we're going to have to solve, because imagine what happens when, how does the pro-transition community calls it, I forget what their phrase is, but they could mandate the opposite.
Gender affirming care.
Thank you. Gender affirming care. They could mandate that and say that if you don't let your child pursue that, you're a bad parent and we're going to take your children away from you. So to me, there's not a good legislative fix. It's got to be sort of a cultural, moral, neighborhood, community, responsible parent fix, which is harder to do, but you can't do it in Washington.
Can I ask a follow-up
Sure.
on that? So again, like using the transitioning kids example, would having a government, based on, and correct me if I'm wrong, what you're saying is that it should be up to the parents and the community, would having a government ban go against that, even if it is of your personal belief that we shouldn't do it? Would having a government ban kind of go against the whole idea of minding your own business?
I don't think I support a federal ban.
Okay.
And I understand that I'm not solving the problem, but I would hate for President AOC to enforce a gender-affirming care mandate on parents, otherwise you lose your kids. And I think that's what happens when you open that door.
Okay. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Hi, I'm Robert Head, and I'm an intern for the House Committee on Small Business Majority Office. And I wanted to ask you, so there's a lot of talk when it comes to young college kids. Democratic socialism seems to be like a popular train of thought for a lot of young kids in college, and they believe that, oh, it's for everybody. I mean, everybody will be taken care of. But the second that somebody disagrees with them, they're like, a lot of them are labeling the other side as crazy or like a monster, not a monster, but just not caring towards others. I just wanted to get your thought on how can we make sure that there's a cohesive thought of being more accepting towards everybody when it comes to their beliefs. And I feel like with democratic socialism, it limits individualism, of course, but also creativity.
Yeah. So this will upset Senator Paul, but I actually made a video years ago when Bernie Sanders was running for president, comparing in a positive way where Bernie was and where Ron Paul was. Mm-hmm. And on a kind of a superficial level, and there's a reason for this, but on a superficial level, if you're against never-ending wars and you're against mass incarceration and you're against crony capitalism, and the list goes on, Ron Paul and Bernie Sanders are exactly the same. Of course, their solutions are fundamentally different, and I think this gets to sort of an empathetic understanding of people that think they're democratic socialists, because the words, it depends what they mean by the words, right? Do they mean socialism where it's government ownership of the means of production and any deviance from that you'll end up in a gulag? Probably not. They don't mean that. And of course, democratic means choice, and socialism means social. So I think we should be open to having a conversation with young people that are sort of flirting with these ideas, and that's sort of the purpose of some of these values that I'm talking about, because I think they would agree with the values. The question is what system gets us there.
And going a little bit further, it's true, a lot of these young kids, they don't really do the research on the socialism aspect. They just like it because it sounds nice. At least that's what my experience is with other people around me in college.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And we've done a lot on this subject, particularly video content, but I'm thinking of one particular documentary we made about a Cuban-born artist named Carlos Luna, who fled Cuba when he was 19 years old because his grandmother told him, and his teacher, his high school teacher, told him you must leave this country, otherwise you won't be allowed to create art. Mm-hmm. And one of the mythologies of democratic socialism is going to free you up from healthcare, it's going to give you universal basic income, so you can go be your creative self. Well, in practice, the opposite is true. There is no tolerance for deviation, for different ideas, and he gave up everything. He never got to see his dad again because he wanted to be a creative. And he's now a wildly successful artist. But our idea was, instead of talking about supply and demand and skyrocketing costs of government-provided health care, let me talk about your sort of creative soul and why it is that you have to live in a free society in order to be free.
Thank you. Also, I think a good example of this whole young people democratic socialism would be somebody like Hassan Piker, who he's like a progressive in the fact that, oh, he wants everybody to be, accepted or whatever. And then the second, like, I heard something he said something about Miami Cubans, and he's like, oh, they're the worst. And, the real Cubans in Cuba, they're great. And, the Miami Cubans are monsters who don't care about their own people back home. And I just think it's very misleading and short-sighted.
He should watch our film.
I will. Yes, sir, I will.
No, he should.
Oh, he should.
Yeah,
he should.
You should too. So this movie, by the way, is called A Free Life. Journey of an Artist? Forgetting all the things today. Portrait of an Artist, which makes more sense. How about here?
Hello, my name is Olivia Siegel. I go to Barnard College. I'm also interning in the Senate. And I have a very short, straightforward question. I heard you mention that you called capitalism the C word and said that you prefer not to use it. And I was just curious as to why.
Yeah. By all accounts, capitalism is a word that was made up by Karl Marx and critics of free markets. And when you think about it, it plays into the character that they want to portray, like the sort of Monopoly Man character, the game Monopoly, because markets are not about capital accumulation. Capital accumulation is one of the things that happens when people are free to work and save and invest. But it's not really about capitalism, it's about consumption. And it's about being free to pursue your dreams and to create things. So I think I guess I like markets better. I haven't thought of a better word to use for it. I prefer to use descriptive words instead of isms. And I realize I'm using the word libertarianism, but I'd rather figure out ways to turn people on. And this, when I go speak to my progressive friends and I'm describing capitalism, I'm just describing the process of people living in an uncertain world, trying to figure out how to do things best for their families and neighbors, and through that process, that struggle, those trades that happen, beautiful things can happen, and people are lifted out of poverty, and people live in homes, and people are able to send their kids to school, and all the beautiful things that happen in free societies that don't happen in collectivist societies. Terry and I just got back from Berlin, and we went to the Stasi Museum. I'm only forgetting the important things. And I knew the story of Eastern Germany, and I knew about the wall, but the way that these centralized systems dehumanized people, you had spouses spying on spouses, and you had families spying on families, and you had best friends spying on best friends. And, if you did the wrong thing, you ended up in a gulag. And ultimately, if you want people to comply to a central plan, that's the only way to do it. It's got to be enforced through violence, because there's always going to be somebody that has a different idea of what to do with their lives. And, I wish everybody that's flirting with socialism should see what the USSR did to East Germans, even though right across the other side of the wall you had a fundamentally different social dynamic. You had the West German economic miracle because people are free to work. Any other questions?
Hello.
Hi.
Thank you so much for all this information. It's been really exciting to kind of hear this conversation. It's my first time being in a space and kind of hearing this perspective, so it's been awesome to hear you. My name is Kayla. I'm an intern for Congresswoman Terry Sewell of Alabama, and I'm still kind of trying to frame this in my head, so bear with me. But in your addressing of kind of your ideals and having a set of values that promote how you feel and the way you kind of see libertarianism and your ideals, how do you see conversations surrounding the history of the systems that have been set up that disproportionately affect certain groups of people? You know, race is a big factor in this country, whether we like it or not. And I just want to understand how in these spaces where the conversations lie that address history, address cultural and moral pitfalls of this country, and how that hasn't been addressed in a lot of different spaces on the right side and the left side. Where do you see conversations like that coming about, where we're actually looking at the reality of the situation and how these people are affected in so many ways? One of the set of values you said that are essential to protect is self-defense, you know, don't get hurt. And I think that is a very, it's elementary and that it should be understood by everybody, but I don't think in my experience that it has been, especially in my culture and my community. So where do you see that falling into place so we can all come together and have that sort of conversation?
And I've had some of those conversations, and I wish I could do it more. When you have a conversation between left and right, it requires a certain level of trust that you're going to be honest in that conversation, and I'd love to do more of it. You know, I think about it as someone that found Martin Luther King to be a hero, both in terms of his philosophy and his activism and his nonviolence approach to social change. The way I think about these things is that quite often the institutional barrier to racial equity, racial justice, as my progressive friends would say, is some government corruption. And I'm not saying that civil society is free of those biases, and history is replete with that as well. But I really think that government should get out of the way and let people start talking to each other, and let's try to figure these things out neighbor to neighbor, because neighbor to neighbor, you don't think about skin color. You don't think about your religion. You don't think about your ethnicity. That's just a friend of yours. And I think all sides politicize this stuff, and they want to make it us versus them. I think it's dangerous, but I think that's precisely what political demagogues do. They want us fighting about that stuff. I don't know if I answered your question, but I think acknowledging all the things like slavery is fundamentally important, because what was my first rule? You own yourself. And slavery is a fundamental violation of that. I don't think we should hide from that, but also I don't think things are getting worse. I think politics is making things worse. I think the rest of us are trying to figure out ways to get along with each other and find common ground and mutual respect. Government screws that up. Where were you pointing? Okay. I'll go up here front. Then I'll go towards the back. Whichever one, it doesn't matter.
Okay. Hello, my name is Daria Manti. I'm an intern with the Senate, and I'm planning to attend Montana State University in the fall. I just had a question. You said that when people are more free, they will have more compassion. Looking at history, with slavery, for instance, when slavery was a choice that could be made by the states, a lot of those states did not make a compassionate choice. What do you think about that?
You're saying states, and I don't know the history enough to give you, you'd have to choose a specific state, but I'm thinking about, quite often racism was legislatively protected. And so it wasn't a social institution, it was a government protected institution. It took a while.
Yeah, I can give you a little bit more information.
Okay.
when the founders were writing the Constitution, they purposefully left slavery out of it, and then slavery wasn't banned by the government until the Emancipation Proclamation, and during that time, Southern states continued to have enslaved people and to not, of course, be compassionate towards them.
Yes. And Thomas Jefferson famously wanted, there was an earlier draft that had that emancipation language in there. And he, of course, you might call him a hypocrite for never being able, never choosing to free his slaves. But I think the point you're making is that it was a political compromise so that the Southern states would sign on. So was it a political compromise that reflected the values of Southern citizens? Probably. And we had to work through that. And it took a Civil War and a fairly bloody civil rights movement to get us through that process. But my argument is basically it was guys like MLK that fixed the problem. It probably wasn't like even, LBJ passes the Civil Rights Act. That was very much driven by citizens demanding that he do something different. The government's a lagging indicator.
Okay, thank you.
Right here.
Well, I just want to thank you again, sir, for coming this afternoon to share a little bit with us about your book and your thoughts. My name's Nick. I'm a junior at I will be a senior at Xavier University in Cincinnati, and I'm currently interning in the House. I was just wondering, kind of revisiting the mind your own business point again, and I know that we touched on it earlier, but just to push it a little bit further. One of my, you mentioned the founders and wanting to protect kind of some of the limited government ideas of the founding and how that defines your stake in libertarianism. One of my favorite quotes from our founders was a John Adams quote that said that our Constitution was made for a moral and religious people and that it is wholly inadequate for a government of any other. And so kind of based on that, I guess my question for you would be, again, in your libertarian lens, is there ever a point where someone or a group of people could stake out a moral high ground? And if so, who would they be? And if not, why?
Yeah, it's funny. John Adams' quote very much reflects the attitude that Adam Smith had when he was writing the Theory of Moral Sentiments, which he wrote before The Wealth of Nations. And the Wealth of Nations is widely viewed as the defense of markets and capitalism. And Adam Smith would make the exact same argument. Like, you need good people if you want to have a functioning, the institutions and the rules of the game don't hurt people and don't take their stuff. You need people to actually believe that with passion. But I think that reinforces my point. It's not, if we're looking for Washington, D.C. to legislate morality, it seems like a punchline almost. It's not the place to do it. It's got to be civil society, it's got to be people helping people, and it's got to be them demanding of Washington that they stay out of their business. And to me, it's always going to be a bottom-up thing. It's not necessarily, I sort of get tired in my old age of debating the ethics of Senator X or, candidate for President Y. Don't look to Washington for that stuff. You'll be disappointed. And there's exceptions, obviously. There's a lot of good people that run for office, but to me, that's a responsibility that's got to be local. It's got to be bottom up.
We have time for one more.
Okay, one more. I'm going to choose you back here.
Thank you. My name is Sky. I'm an Alaska Native from Alaska, and I'm interning for the Senate currently. So I'm very curious, what role should the federal government play when supporting remote communities from my village, Hudaliakagat, that lack infrastructure?
The federal government?
Yes.
I wouldn't do it through the federal government. I mean, Alaska is a unique state in that there's revenue that comes from oil, but I'd keep the feds out of it, because if you want them to support your community, they're going to come at you with mandates on how you structure your community, what you do in your community, and it's a double-edged sword. It's a little bit like inviting a vampire into your house. Might seem like a good idea, but I would never trust the government, and particularly when it comes to Indigenous people. Do you really want the federal government involved in how you should live your lives? The history of that is quite tragic.
Thank you.
Sure thing.
All right,
Thank you.
Thank you. All right, you'll be hearing about next week, same time, same day, I think Thursday, we'll have Georgetown law professor, constitutional scholar Randy Barnett will be with us to talk about originalism. You'll love him. He, like Matt, has been a speaker in the past who we bring back because he's so well received. You can get your vouchers over here for lunch. See you in a week. Thank you, Matt.